Good evening, everyone. We shall make a start. Ακούγομαι? Ωραία. Dear members and friends, welcome to tonight's Greek History and Culture Seminar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respect to elders past and present. I'd like to thank Tina Yannukos and the Iliades Women's Network Victoria for their kind donation, which contributes to making tonight's presentation possible. I'd also like to encourage you all to consider sponsoring a seminar. It can be a lecture of your choice, and there are still several unallotted seminars. Thanks to our corporate sponsors, all donations are tax deductible. A reminder, if you haven't put your phone on silent, to please do so now. Tonight's seminar is titled The Democratic Army of Greece Through the Tashkent Archives. Following the defeat of the Democratic Army of Greece at the Battle of Grammos in August 1949, Rus ended up in political exile across the people's democracies of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Amongst them, about 12,000 Democratic Army fighters were relocated to Tashkent, the capital of Soviet Uzbekistan. This group includes the remaining core of the military forces, much of the officer corps, and those considered most capable of sustaining the struggle from abroad. Nick Dallas, one of the earliest scholars to explore the archives of the Greek community in Tashkent, will present evidence for the first time drawn from the registration procedures carried out in the early years of exile. By analysing thousands of registration cards containing detailed personal and military information, he reconstructs a highly detailed and comprehensive portrait of the men and women who made up the Democratic Army of Greece. Επειδή είμαστε ελληνική κοινότητα και θεωρούμε καθήκον μας να λέμε έστω και λίγα λόγια στα ελληνικά, θα κάνω μια σύντομη περίληψη στα ελληνικά. Μετά την ήττα του Δημοκρατικού Στρατού Ελλάδας στη μάχη του Γράμμου τον Αύγουστο του 1949, περίπου 100.000 άνθρωποι κατέφυγαν σε πολιτική εξορία στις λαϊκές δημοκρατίες της Ανατολικής Ευρώπης και στην Σοβιετική Ένωση. Περίπου 12.000 μαχητές εγκαταστάθηκαν στη Τασχέντη, αποτελώντας τον βασικό πυρήνα των στρατιωτικών δυνάμεων και του αξιωματικού σώματος. Ο Νίκος Ντάλλας, μελετώντας τα αρχεία της ελληνικής κοινότητας Τασχέντης και χιλιάδες δελτία καταγραφής με προσωπικά και στρατιωτικά στοιχεία, παρουσιάζει για πρώτη φορά μια τεκμηριωμένη και λεπτομερή εικόνα της σύνθεσης του Δημοκρατικού Στρατού Ελλάδος. And now a few words about our presenter. For those who may be wondering, who is Nick Dallas? He's a man admired and respected by many, and the gentleman who would usually stand here in my place introducing the presenter of the Greek History and Culture seminars. Nick Dallas arrived in Melbourne in 1971 on board the iconic migrant ship, the Patris. He's a graduate of the University of Melbourne, where he has completed Bachelor of Science, Arts and Commerce undergraduate degrees, a PhD in Organic Chemistry. He works in educational publishing and since 2012 has been director of the Board of Management of the Greek Community of Melbourne, the chair of its education committee and the conveyor of the seminar program. Since December 2024, he has been a PhD candidate at the University of Macedonia's Department of Balkan, Slavic and Oriental Studies in Thessaloniki, where he's researched Greek political exiles that arrived in Tashkent in 1949 after the Greek Civil War. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, but now please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Nick Dallas.
Thank you for those kind words, Simala. It's been a bit rushed. I could do with a beer at the moment, but anyway, let's proceed with the show. Firstly, thank you all for attending today, and a big welcome to those who are at the Greek Centre for the first time. There are many events held here, so look out for them. Everyone is welcome. What I'll be presenting today is some of the preliminary results of my PhD research. They're not the final results, but I don't expect them to be massively modified either. They're almost sort of near complete. And they're part of my PhD thesis. I'm doing a PhD by distance. The university is in Greece, as Simela said, the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki. I'm based in Melbourne, and the archives are halfway in between in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. And in my PhD, I'm trying to develop a demographic and sociological profile of the combatants that constituted the Democratic Army and arrived in Tashkent in 1949. My supervisors, Professor Nikos Marantzidis, and my co-supervisors are two Melbourne-based historians, Professor Sheila Fitzpatrick and Joy Demusi. Joy Demusi was here also on Tuesday, the sort of book launch. And Joy also had an uncle in Tashkent, and she only found out from me after going through the archives. So I think you'd be surprised by how many people do have a Tashkent connection. Now, why do we need this research? Hasn't so much been done on the Civil War, books, monographs, conferences, even films. Well, we need this research for a variety of reasons. We're doing it for a variety of reasons. It still remains an under-researched topic, the Civil War and its aftermath. Furthermore, it's still something very topical. Those fault lines still exist in Greek society today. 100,000 people ended up in political exile. They left behind around 500,000 relatives in Greece, 3-4 generations down the track. So there's several million people who have some type of direct or indirect connection to someone who was in political exile. Especially if you're from central and northern Greece, there were very few families that weren't affected. Now, we sort of know the big picture who these combatants were. You know, they're from central northern Greece, they're mainly of rural background, they were semi-literate. But the archives we have in Tashkent, for the first time, allows us to develop a very accurate and detailed sort of picture. Whatever trends I describe today, they're not estimates. Whatever trends I describe are fully backed by the names and personal details of all the combatants that make up those trends. A lot has been said about the Civil War. A lot has been written about the Civil War. As researchers, as historians, we have an obligation to verify what's been written or said, but at the same time, also refute any existing narratives, because they are reproduced, they are repeated. If they're accurate, why not? But if they're not accurate, they have to be corrected. When you research this topic, the classic book on this topic is a book by Gavrilis Lambatos. It was published in 2001, about 25 years ago. That remains the classic text, and you see it sort of finishes in 1957. There's been a more recent book by Lenin Nikolaidou that has some new Soviet archives and references. However, whatever is written on this topic, not just these two books, but any thesis, any other books, no work has incorporated the archives of Tashkent. That's the main differentiating feature of my research, the details in those archives. What Lambato used, and a lot of other researchers, is the archives of ASCII, Archia Secret Kinekis Historias. After the Civil War, the head office of the KKE, the Greek Communist Party, was located to Bucharest, Romania. After the split in 1968 into the exterior and interior wings, the archives of the KKE ended up with KKE Interior, which then, and now they're being held by ASCII. Another advantage that Lambatos had was that 20 years ago, there were more people alive that he could interview. In my particular case, any of the original fighters, they're sort of all in their 90s, and you'll see some of them sort of later on. I don't have that advantage. Let's go to the start of the story, which is the end of the Greek Civil War, the last battle being the Battle of Grammos, finished at the end of August in 1949. The defeated Democratic Army of Greece retreated towards Albania. Thousands gathered there, the combatants and their sort of supporters. And from Albania, then they were dispersed to various parts, mainly to Eastern European countries, and the Soviet Union. When you research this topic, this is a table that you'll come across in many references. It says that there were 56,000 people. Let me get this working. There were 56,000 people in exile, and out of those, 17,000 were children. In the Soviet Union, or Tashkent, Soviet Uzbekistan, it says there were no children. There were some children, but very few, in the tens, but they were more in the other jurisdictions. This table does not include those that were in Yugoslavia and Albania. So if you had another 30,000 there, you can see how you can come very close to a 100,000 number. What's also important about this table, 56 minus 17 is 39,000 adults or combatants. So out of the 39,000, 16,500, about 40% were KKE members, full members or probationary members. Out of the 16,500, 8,000, almost 50%, were in Tashkent, in the Soviet Union, about 50%. So the central offices of the KKE might have been in Bucharest, but the heart and soul of the Democratic Army, the KKE, was Tashkent. Political developments there had reverberations in the rest of the political diaspora as well. And this table came from a report by Vasilis Barziotas, who's a member of the Central Committee from Larissa, and there was a meeting, a symposium in October 1950 in Bucharest. That's the source of this table, that report there. So this hasn't turned out. Oh, okay. I think when I copied it across, some of the detail went missing, so I'll fit it in. Those that gathered in Albania were divided into two broad groups. The elderly, the children, the disabled, the wounded were sent. In other words, those that needed special treatment were sent to countries in Eastern Europe, where they went to sanatoria, to hospitals, to childcare centres. What happened? Polish ships arrived in the Albanian port of Durrës, and they were shipped. The ships left, went through the Straits of Gibraltar, through the North Sea, to the Polish port of Gdynia. There they were put on railway wagons and were sent to various European countries. Some of them were resettled in villages where Germans were expelled, like in Silesian Poland or Sudetenland in sort of Czechoslovakia. There was also another ship, a Romanian ship, the Transylvania, that went to Constanta. So I've got all the routes here, but they didn't transfer across. Now, and then you were left with 12,000, another 12,000 fighters, men and women of fighting age. The remaining force left, the officer corps, the most political loyal part of the DSE. Those that were perceived most capable of continuing the struggle abroad were transferred to Tashkent in Soviet Uzbekistan. So the ships left Albania, went south of Crete, turned northwards through the international waters of the Aegean, through the Dardanelles, into the Black Sea, and arrived at the Georgian port of Poti. Across to Baku, Azerbaijan, across the Caspian Sea to Turkmenistan, and then by train to Tashkent. It took about 2 weeks, the overall journey. These are just some of the names of the ships that were used. Some of the Soviet ships were actually American ships, ex-Liberty ships brought through the Lend-Lease program. And this is the journey. They were sort of secret evacuations. They were sleeping in the cargo hold of the vessels. So it took about 2 weeks, and finally arriving in Tashkent. And for those who plan to travel to Uzbekistan after this presentation, where is Tashkent? It's in the eastern part of the country, near the Kazakh border, and a lot of you might recognize the old Silk Road cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. Now, the big question for everyone is, why Tashkent? Why Tashkent? Several reasons. Number one, the Cold War had just begun. You could not have 12,000 armed fighters on the borders between Greece and Albania. It had the potential of creating a diplomatic incident. Plus, Albania itself wasn't very stable either. So they had to be far away. It was an out of sight, out of mind solution, and Tashkent was far enough. Another reason, the KKE leadership saw advantages in Tashkent. In Tashkent, its fighters would get educated, would acquire new skill sets, would enter production. So from simple peasant farmers, they'd be transformed into specialised workers, technicians and scientists. And one day, when Greece would become a people's republic, they'd have the experience, the knowledge and skill sets to take on the reins of power, thus fulfilling their historical role. That's how they saw it. A third reason, and arguably this might be one of the more important ones, after the World War II, the Soviet population went backwards. They lost 30 million people. Reconstruction had begun. They had a severe labour shortage. There were 5 million POWs, mainly German, fewer Japanese, working construction programs. They had to be returned. They couldn't stay there forever. Meanwhile, 4 million Soviet POWs were to be returned, but you still had a deficit of 1 million. So there were attempts to bring in labour to assist in that reconstruction process. I figure that something that very few people know, during that period of time, we're talking about post-World War II, 100,000 Armenians from the Armenian diaspora came to Soviet Armenia. And out of those, 18,500 were from Greece. They were sort of expelled, invited to leave in inverted commas. What you also find is that during World War II, the population of Tashkent mushroomed because 150 factories, industrial enterprises, were transferred there down to the last bolt because it was safe. It was behind the Urals. But once the war ended, most people returned to their place of origin. So after the war, Tashkent was competing with every other city in the Soviet Union for that scarce labour. And look at the population here of Tashkent in 1939, 585,000. After 15 years, it's rather static. Again, because most people, you got that population burst and most people returned. It was also fortuitous that towards the end of 1949, there were 20,000 Japanese POWs. They had to be returned to Japan. And so it was fortuitous that the Greeks were arriving at least to take their place, to neutralise some of that labour shortage. If you go to Tashkent today, there's a Japanese museum. You can see some of the clothing of the POWs there. This is a Japanese music band. The writing here, so even until as late as July, even August 1949, the Japanese were still there. The Greeks arrived in October. The writing here is in Cyrillic. It's in the Uzbek language. Today, the Uzbek language is written with the Latin script. Where were the Japanese housed? In these settlements here. Some were army barracks. And these settlements later on, which housed the Greeks, were labelled polities. So in Tashkent, there were 14 polities, 12 in Tashkent, and 2 in a satellite town known as Tirtsik, about 30 kilometres outside Tashkent. Okay, so that was the initial accommodation of the Greeks. Now today, fast forward to today, what's left of the Greek community is Greek Cultural Centre, which was built by the partisans for cultural activities. So there's the theatre inside, and once you go into the theatre, the podium there, you see this banner, "Με τη σκέψη πάντα σε πατρίδα," with our thoughts always on the homeland. So from the first day they arrived, the first thing on their mind was, we want to return one day, which is natural. I think that's the dream of nearly all migrants. It's just a temporary interlude migration. Inside the foyer, there's various posters on the walls, and this is a common one you'll see reproduced in books. The first day is in Uzbekistan. We came in 1949. There are almost 12,000, 1,197. As you see here, very few children, and this is the ratio between men and women. Regarding education levels, just over 1,700 were illiterate. Over 9,000 had rudimentary primary school education. That could be just 1 year of primary or even 6 years of primary education. Very few had tertiary level education. But that would have been quite common for the rest of Greece as well. And I'm just showing now, by chance, some archives have survived. They take up about 2 cupboards. I'm sure there were more archives, but over time they've been lost, destroyed, who knows. And these were saved accidentally, so I've been very fortunate in that respect. There's a lot of registration cards, which I'll talk about later. You'll see some of them here. There's several hundred sort of case studies. In most of the case studies, people are being expelled for the party, either for not paying their membership dues or inappropriate behaviour. But the cards I've been working on are these cards here. There was a registration process in 1952. There's 16,000 of them. They measure about 9 by 13 centimetres. Now, you say, before I said there were 12,000 fighters, why do you have 16,000 cards? Well, that's because about 4,000 cards are of children that are either were born in Tashkent or came from Eastern Europe, and I've had to sort of separate those. And there's another 2,000 of people that came from Eastern Europe as well, because what happened was that the fighters could have been in Tashkent, their parents could have been in Poland, the children in Romania or Hungary. So once they realised their stay was going to be a bit longer, there were attempts made to reunite families. That's why the population increased rapidly. Plus, there was a baby boom because they were all so young. That's another story. Now, let's look at some of these registration cards in detail. Okay, these are some of the better ones because they're legible. A lot of them is just doctor's handwriting in them, so that's been one of the major challenges. Let's look at the one on the right. They all have most of them have a registration number, the name of the combatant, in this case, Marika Skafida Floraki. She was the first wife of former KKE General Secretary Harilos Florakis. Her parents, the year of birth, 1931. Where she was born, at the village, district, and also prefecture level. Her education level, that's year 10. Her ethnicity, Helleniki Greek. She was a student. Did you speak any foreign languages? No. There's 2 fields here. Were they in the National Army or were they in the resistance in Yambelas? 99% of the time, these were left blank. And then there are details about the Democratic Army. When did they join? In this case, the 5th of June, 1947. What was their rank? Υπολογαγός, lieutenant. What was their role? In this case, P epsilon is politikos epitropos, political officer, political commissar. The next card is from Pantelis Vainas. He was the right-hand man of Nikos Zachariadis, the General Secretary at the time, and he was a liaison officer with respects to the Slav Macedonians that were in Tashkent. He was from Florina. When you look at ethnicity here, it says Slavo-Macedona, Slav Macedonian. When I use the term Slav Macedonian in today's presentation, it denotes Greek citizens, Greek citizens, overwhelmingly bilingual, who do not necessarily identify as Greek ethnically. And I use that term because that's the term in the archives, that's the term used by the KKE, and that was the terminology of the period. He was a colonel, Syntagmatarchis, and he joined in 1946. He was a volunteer, so it's either volunteer or epistativmenos, conscriptee. These are the back of the cards. Can someone tell me what this word says here? I asked a researcher and she said paracetamol, paracetamol. It says metaboles. Okay, so movements. And the first thing you see here, which politia did they live in? Were they settled in? The 6th politia, in this case, the 7th politia. Later on, they moved to the 10th here. That person moved to the 7th, returned to the 6th, and 957, they left for Yugoslavia. So a list of their movements. At the bottom, you can see their rank, Antipologos. They became a 2nd lieutenant, and then you see Saga. That's the officer school. Many went through a 3-month crash course to become officers because there was a shortage of skilled fighters. And because of the date, the 27th of July 49, that's the graduation date. They were from the 6th cohort. that went through that training. This person here has to be a female fighter because she was awarded Parasimo Electras on the 25th of April 1949. Okay, does anyone know this person? Alki Sevastikoglu. That's Alki Zey, the Greek writer. Her husband, Yorgos Sevastikoglu, the director, was in Tashkent, and she came to Tashkent in 1954 to be with him. Now, with these cards, if the number is greater than 12,000, more specifically 11,953, it means that they came to Tashkent later. They didn't arrive in 1949. That's one of the techniques I use to differentiate the cards and see who were the original and who came later. This is the back of another card. You can see the dates of promotion from second lieutenant to lieutenant Logagos to captain Logagos. This is just some of the detail on the back of the card. Probably the most famous Greek born in Tashkent was the Greek Maradona Vasilis Kazipanagis. Okay? This is his child card. I said I've got about 2,000 child cards. He was born in Tashkent in 1954. And this is the card of his father, Kyriakos Kazipanagis, who was Greek Cypriot, born in Amochosto. Okay. Now, those small cards were from the 1952 registration process. There's another set around 12,000 cards of the 1955 registration process. They're much larger cards, more detailed cards. They're A4 double-sided. They have similar information at the beginning, but then they've got some more family information, their marital status, further down what battalion they were in, were they ever wounded, were they awarded any medals, what battles they took place in. You can see that this person was at the Battle of Grammos. If they were party members, you can see here, and their relatives, their first degree relatives. This case is a simple case because they were all in Greece. This is again Maria Skafida from before. However, if you look at some other cards, the situation is more complex. The families are quite dispersed. Like this person here, they have relatives in Greece, in Yugoslavia, in Hungary, and in Tashkent Soviet Union. This person here has relatives in Romania, Canada, and so forth. And what we find that on average, the Slav Macedonians, their families were more greatly dispersed than the Greeks. I haven't really relied, it's not a PhD that relies on sort of interviews because those that are still alive are a handful and they're sort of all in the 90s, but I have managed to uncover a few people. One was this fellow from Sydney, Thanasis Yerakas from Aidonia Grevanas, who was able to interview. And you can see in his case, all his family, a lot of his family members were in Czechoslovakia. So after a few years, he moved to Czechoslovakia, then Greece, and then to sort of Australia. In January, just a couple of months ago, I was fortunate enough to meet Maria Skafida Floraki. She's a youngish 95 at the moment. She's probably the oldest and highest ranking member of the Democratic Army that's still alive at the moment. Her biography was released about 2 years ago, and she was quite grateful I was able to find the registration cards. It was like the missing part in the puzzle. Yeah. Okay, so in the end, how many arrived in Tashkent? According to the Greek community there, 11,997. According to the report from Barziotas, 11,980. Some figures from the Soviet Interior Ministry, 12,020. But this is February, so I'm sure in those 3 months, a few children were born as well. I've picked up 12,088 in my research. From the small cards, I've identified around 11,600 names. The rest of the names have come through a reconstruction process. In other words, the larger cards, I've got names there that don't have smaller cards, and I've put a few filters there as well. So it's not a foolproof system. But literally, if they arrived in 1949, I've almost 99.99%, I've got everyone there. So if you have relatives who believed arrived in 49, I'm sure they have their details, so don't hesitate to see me at some future point. What have I done with all this data? transcribed all this data and I've dumped it in an Excel spreadsheet to make it easier to analyze. In this case, we're looking at surnames beginning with lambda, so you can see the different sort of columns there, taken from the field of the registration cards. Then I've also added my own columns. I've added a column for gender to work out a male-female ratio. I've placed in a formula here to work out their age in 1949. And what's the name of the nomor, the prefecture today? Because the boundaries were very different back then in 1949. There was no nomos Grevenon, it was part of Kozani. There was no nomos Perias as part of Thessaloniki. Kasoria was an eparchia of sort of Florina. And plus, sometimes the villages also changed prefectures as well. Like Descati, which was eparchia Las Zonas Lares, is now as part of Grevena. So there's many of those examples as well. And I'm pretty sure when I've got all this information, I've probably missed out one or two as well. And then I've noted down the region of Greece. These are the regions of Greece. But with Macedonia, I've divided it into three: Western, Central, and Eastern Macedonia, and you'll see why later on. And Kasoria, Florina, and Kozani, and Grevena make up, they're the prefectures that make up sort of Western Macedonia, and they play a prominent role. I've also tried to simplify the education levels into sort of illiterate, primary, secondary, and then university and technical vocational education. As you go across, there's columns about their rank, if they were in Elas or the National Army, if they were political officers, if they went to officer training school, when they joined the Democratic Army, were they volunteers or conscriptees, the politia win. So overall, I've probably got over 300,000 data points. So what trends you can discern from that is just really limited by your imagination. So you do have a lot of data there to sort of analyze. Let's look at the results. Basically, with my results of 12,088, I get the same male to female ratio as the Greek community there. So it's fairly much spot on. For every one woman, there were 2.5 men. So you had in the politias, in the settlements, you had a surplus of men. However, in Tashkent and generally the Soviet Union, you had a surplus of women because so many got killed during the war. So it's natural that after a short while, there are many mixed unions that took place. In fact, if you read the biography of Stelios Yatrodakis, who was from a small Cretan village, he says, I went into Tashkent with a group of Andartes. We went into town, and I was shocked. The buses, the trams, the trolleys, they all had female drivers, and so he couldn't believe it, someone coming from a small Cretan village. But there wasn't a job that women didn't do during the Soviet Union during the war efforts. So, yeah. So if you look at the age ratio, the average age is 26, slightly higher for men, 27.94, 21 for women. So there was a baby boom in the next few years. And you can see the age ranges. So they're all fairly young. Look, the biggest cohort here is 20 to 24, just under sort of 4,000 as well. So once you get above 40, the numbers really drop off. So that's why when I was looking at those criteria in the reconstruction process, if they were very young or very old, I could quite easily sort of remove them. Let's look at the fields of ethnicity and education levels. 99.7% declared either Greek or Slav Macedonian ethnicity. The fact that you find very small numbers of Vlach, Arvanitiki, Bulgarian, Armenian, Albanian is really no surprise. The only other group which is significant is those that identified who declared Turkish ethnicity. And in this particular case, some didn't actually say Turkish, they said Ottoman or Mohammedan. But some research that I've done on this matter, in fact, and some that I've met in Greece, they were mainly from Thraki, from the prefectures of Rhodope and Xanthi, and they all seem to be from Pomek villages as well. So what it shows is that the Pomeks are a group in Greece and Bulgaria who speak a Slavic language, but are Muslim in religion. So it looks like they give greater weighting to the religious identity rather than their linguistic identity. These are the figures here from the Greek community when they first arrived. 14.3% were illiterate. This registration process took place in 1952, so after sort of less than 3 years, that rate dropped fairly quickly. There's a big emphasis placed on education, and within the decade, illiteracy was sort of wiped out. And you can see those with tertiary level education literally sort of tripled in a very short period of time. It's a field that I'm still sort of working on, but you can see some progress here. The region of birth. 37.4% came from Western Macedonia. We said the 4 prefectures of Kastoria, Florida, Grevena, and Kozani. And in total, more than half were from Macedonia. Around 18% from Thessaly, mainly from Larissa. 11% from Epirus, mainly Yanina, 80%. 6.7% from central Greece, mainly north and central Greece, Phthiotidas and Evrytanias. And 700 are from Thrace, around 600 of those from Nomos Evro. Now, these people that were born in Turkey or Russia, they're really refugees that came to Greece mainly after the Asia Minor catastrophe. And the reason the numbers are so low, because I think it's around 22% the population of Greece that has a refugee background, is that the average age was 26. So 1949 minus 26 is 1923. Most of these people were born after the Asia Minor catastrophe, so yeah. Now, you don't find many from southern Greece or the islands, and those that you do find from the islands are mainly seamen. Things weren't going well at Grammos for the Democratic Army of Greece, and Zachariadis put out a call to the Seamen's Union. We need assistance in Grammos, and some seamen did make the journey, arrived in Grammos, retreated to Albania, ended up in Tashkent. But there's also another story around them as well. How does this look at the prefecture level? If you notice here, 4 out of the top 6 are all from Western Macedonia. Kastoria, Florina, and then Kozani and Grevena, and completed by Pelas, Evro, Phthiotidas, and Karditsis. So, as you can see here, almost 1 in 8 were from Kastoria and 1 in 8 in sort of from Florina. And on this column here, you see the percentage of volunteers from those areas. It's as high as 92.4% in Evro, Thraki, and then it's as low as 55% from Yanina. And we can discuss later why that might be the case. At the village level, where did they come from? Number 1 was Agios Germanos from Florida, 77%. This is in the Lake Prespa district. By the way, Helen Vetsikopoulos is from that village, and she's also done some research in this area. Second village is in Ziaka. That's where I'll be on Monday from Grevena, 72. Specifically with this village, nearly more than half of the village was actually in political exile. You see a lot of villages from Kastoria and Florina, Antarctico, Vapsori, Vrondero there, quite a few. And then you also see villages from Yanina, from the so-called Mastorochoria. They called Mastorochoria because, I mean, the land was very infertile there, so a lot of the men were in the building trades. They formed construction gangs and travelled Greece and other countries and work on construction projects. So villages like Aitomilica, Kerasovo, Zermo, Playa, they're all Mastorochoria from Yanina. They were also at the foothills of Mount Grammos as well, so it's not surprising they were caught up in the civil war. And then you've got a few other villages from other prefectures, Tsaritsani in Larissa. You mentioned the Skati before Grevenon, and so forth. Now, this slide I show with a bit of caution, because when you get asked what part of Greece are you from, sometimes you don't mention your village because no one knows it. So you mentioned the nearest town or the capital city of the prefecture. Naousa seems to have the highest number here, 123. Very few from Athens, which is only sort of 40. I mean, more than 90% of the fighters did have a rural background. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the Mastorochoria and the aftermath of the Civil War. Greece is really devastated, especially villages in northern Greece that were severely depopulated. And I mentioned Mesopotamia simply because I had the figures. I could have quite easily done other regions as well. Here you see some of the villages of the Mesopotamia and northern Epirus or Yanina. The population, the 1940 census, a decade later, 1951. The departed is the difference, and then I've done a percentage. Some villages were literally obliterated, like Zerma, minus 90% population decline, Likorachi, minus 82, Plikati, minus 88, Oxia, minus 90, Asimokhori, minus 85, Hionadis, minus 73. So an overall 54% decline. And here are the numbers that actually were in Tashkent. If there are 248 in Tashkent, there was easily more than 1,000 in political exile when you include Eastern Europe as well. So out of that almost 4,000 that departed, you probably had 1,000 that went into exile, 1,000 probably went to Australia, Canada, and the USA, and probably 2,000 internal migration to cities of Greece like Yanina, Thessaloniki, and Athens. But you see the depletion of rural Greece. You can't study the Greek Civil War or analyze it without also researching the issue of the Slav Macedonians, because they were a significant component of the Democratic Army. And there were 2,700 in Tashkent, and out of those, about 80% came from two prefectures, Florina Kasuria, which is not surprising here, then from Pella and Kozani, and then the numbers really sort of drop off. The figures that we have on them, again, come from the report of Barziotas. Remember the 56,000? It doesn't include those that were in Yugoslavia. And out of those, about 20,000, 35% identified as Slav Macedonian. For the Soviet Union or Tashkent, the figure is 24%. My research comes up with a figure with 22.5. It's not too far off the mark. There are higher numbers in other countries, like up to 47% in Poland, 40% in Romania, but that was also influenced by the greater number of Slav Macedonian children in those countries as well. One thing I also want to mention is that when you do this research, you always have to be very careful and circumspect about the numbers. In a lot of books, you'll find this reference. For example, Kiryazovsky, the English officer Woodhouse, and Zaussis. And there's a claim that at the end of 1949, the Democratic Army was left with 22,000 combatants. Sometimes this number is 20,000. And out of those, 14,000 were Slav Macedonians. So 22 minus 14 is 8,000 Greek combatants. Now, I have 9,300 Greek combatants just in Tashkent without including those that were in Eastern Europe. So always be cautious with the figures that you come across, because you really want people to be able to at least claim where they've sort of sourced them from. Because a lot of things written about the Greek Civil War are also estimates and opinions. As I said, almost 1 in 4 in Tashkent identified Slav Macedonian, and I will have a chapter on this in my thesis. What you don't see in the literature and the bibliography is the voices of those fighters. And why don't you see that? And I think there's sort of several reasons. By the mid-1960s, most of them, I can't put an accurate number to it, but more than half had left Tashkent. And why do I say that? Where's the evidence? There used to be a party newspaper in Tashkent, Prostiniki, towards victory. Later on, it changed its name to Neos Dromos, New Road, in about 1958, 1960. There was a page in Macedonian, back to front, in that paper. By the late 1960s, that page ceases to exist. It's definitely not in 1970. I can't pinpoint the exact date because there are missing issues in archives. So why did it cease? The demand wasn't there, or even the editors themselves had left Tashkent. Another bit of evidence is, again, from a footnote in the book of Lambatos, a report, education report by Karadza, who was in head of education, looking at the 1961-1962 school year. There were 2,597 students, and only 290 were studying Macedonian. So it's only 11.2% of students. If they were 22, 23%, why only 11.2%? I don't think they had more or fewer children than the Greeks. So you can see they're starting to depart. But I think the main reason why they've probably left is that in September 1955 in Tashkent, there were armed clashes between pro and anti-Zakhariadis factions. The Slav Macedonians were overwhelmingly pro-Zakhariadis, as were most of the Greeks, as were most of the party members. After 1955, it became very difficult to be pro-Zakhariadis. You were discriminated against. Some even ended up in sort of Siberia. Furthermore, it's the period of desalinization. Khrushchev is in power. He's mended fences with Tito. So Yugoslavia now becomes a migration destination for those fighters. Tito gave them incentives. He also gave Greeks incentives, some cases even sort of free housing. And they had family there as well, but they also had family in other countries overseas and also in Eastern Europe. So they've started to depart. And by the mid-1960s, late 1960s, more than half have left. The others were probably in mixed unions or were strongly bicultural, and they've seemed to sort of assimilate to life in Tashkent. But there is an absence of voices in the bibliography. Let's look at some of the military details. From the 12,088 names that I have, I've removed 48 because these were POWs from the Greek National Army that were in Tashkent. And of the remainder, almost 76% were volunteers. 22% were conscriptees. You have here 75 defectors. And where you have blank, there's either no reply or really they were too young to be one or the other. So it's a very high percentage, 76%. I'm not saying during the course of the Civil War, where it's believed 100,000 joined the ranks of the Democratic Army, was that high, but it would have definitely been a double-digit number and a high double-digit number. Don't forget, those who went to Tashkent were also, to a certain degree, the most trusted as well. Let's look at the comparison of volunteers to conscriptees and how that changes by year of recruitment. 1946 was the first year of the Civil War. Almost 99% were volunteers. Out of the 2,245 that were in Tashkent and recruited in 1946, 99% were volunteers. The largest year, 1947, almost 5,000 troops there. That percentage is still very high, 85% volunteers. It drops in 48, the overall number drops, so does the level of volunteers, 63%, but still very high. And in 1949, it's the first time the number of conscriptees are greater than the number of volunteers, not by a large margin, but still they've overtaken them. And notice here that the numbers drop significantly. By then, 1947, the Americans enter the Greek Civil War in a large way and provide almost unlimited sort of military aid and support. A lot of the villages are being emptied, so it's harder for the Democratic Army to recruit as well. And these are the general trends you see in the Greek Civil War. Let's look at the situation with women in the Democratic Army. They made about 28% of the combatants in Tashkent. In 1946, there were barely 100 women, and nearly all of them, 95 of the 98 were volunteers, 4.4%. The largest recruitment year, 1947, that ratio increases to 19%, and in the 3.5 to 1 ratio, though still mainly volunteers. Once you get to 1948, it's interesting because the ratio of men to women are almost the same. It becomes more difficult to recruit, and there's a greater reliance on recruiting women. And also, you see for the first time, the volunteers are less than the conscriptees. And then the final year of the Civil War, the numbers drop significantly. Conscriptees are almost greater than a 2-to-1 ratio, And again, the numbers are fairly similar between men and women. And these are also the trends generally you see over the course of the Greek Civil War. It's reflected in the combatants in Tashkent. What I've also done is analyse the ranks of the soldiers there. And to me, this is sort of quite surprising. Out of the 12,000 fighters there, 36.1% held officer ranks, from Antipolochayi, second lieutenant, to sort of up to major generals. Those that were simple soldiers, auxiliary staff, about 36.7%. So it's almost like a one-to-one ratio between, let's say, simple soldiers and officer staff. In a normal army, under normal conditions, that ratio is at least 10 to 1, if not 20 to 1. Arthur, you might have a better idea. So, and even with the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, they're fewer than the officers. That ratio is normally 3 to 1 in favour of the NCOs. So why do we have this abundance of officers? Variety of reasons. There's a lot of fast tracking of promotions to officers for a variety of reasons. Firstly, experienced combatants were being lost in battle, and they had to fast track people in promotions. That's why they created those officer schools in Saga and Kane. So in a 3-month crash course, they could become officers and leading battalions. Another reason is they would give promotions to keep morale high in those units. If you went through, if you became a political officer, political commissar, immediately once you graduated, you were a second lieutenant, Antipolokagos. If you had some degree of specialisation, like let's say anti-aircraft artillery or something like that, you immediately you became an officer as well. So for deeds of bravery, you could be immediately promoted to officer rank. So on the one hand, you had these ranks which are similar to National Army because it gives the impression you're the government in waiting, but they shouldn't be considered exactly equivalent in terms of training and so forth. But they definitely would have had battlefield experience, because often when they went through officer school, often it took more than 3 months because there were breaks because they had to go to battle, so it wasn't just a non-stop learning or training. Another thing that sort of surprised me was that 1 in 11 were political officers, politiki epitropi. And it was actually good timing that when I started my PhD, this book came out by Filio Tolya. Her inspiration was her grandmother, who was in Tashkent, and she was a political officer. And she said, why don't you write something about us? Once you became a political officer, political epitropo, your name was published in the Gazette of the Provisional Government. So she went through all those issues, transcribed more than 2,500 names, dumped them in an Excel spreadsheet like I've done, and in majority of cases, found short biographies for all of them. Like her PhD is almost 1,500 pages, but half it's an appendix with all that sort of information. So it was over a decade. So what I've been doing is I've been cross-matching my data with hers. I also have names that she doesn't have because there are also many political officers whose names weren't published in that gazette. And I'm just mentioning within those 1,067, there are 134 women and 153 Slav Macedonians who are also political officers. Now, what was the role of the political officer? Because you do see them, in the Russian Civil War with the Bolsheviks. Some say there were even political officers in the French Revolution. The political officer in the Democratic Army was like the right-hand person to the military commander. So the military commander can focus simply on military matters. They'll handle all the rest. Issues of clothing, issues of food. They tried to prevent desertions, education, ideological training. So they had multiple roles. They're very important figures. And this is just the officer. There were 2 main officer training schools, Saga and Kane. There were 6 cohorts that went through the Saga officer training school and 2 in Kane. Out of the almost 3,000 officers that graduated, about 1,000 were in Tashkent. You can see those numbers. You can see those numbers there. I still have a lot to work to do on this, on the occupations of the combatants. Although 90% had a rural background, just because they were a rural and provincial economy doesn't mean that everyone is involved with farming or animal husbandry. They're still very complex economies. You still need many professions. So even rural economies, they need your butcher, they need your baker, they need your shoemaker. So these are some of the range of professions that they had before arriving in Tashkent, but they're only, as I said, they're from rural backgrounds. And I've also noted here some of the marine professions, because there were over 100 seamen as well that reached Tashkent. And so this is their pre-49 occupations. And when you move to 1955, in the space of 5 years, you can see the massive transformation. There are a lot of sort of factories in the area, building cotton harvesters, building aircraft. So you can see they've become, there's a lot of welders in that mix, a lot of fitter and turners, many professions involved with metallurgy, and a lot of them got involved with construction. Some were already builders from Greece, but more and more turned to that profession because it paid better. And after a few years, the government gave the Greeks some land to build their own homes, and within a decade, all of them had their own homes, which is quite remarkable because the issue of housing was always a perennial problem in the Soviet Union, either not enough or inadequate. So it's sort of quite an achievement. I'm going to sort of end here. I hope I've been able to show that at least those that went to Tashkent were chosen. They were chosen because they were deemed the most suitable to be able to continue the struggle abroad. That's why you had a lot of political officers, you had a lot of the officer corps, those that were most loyal to the party. And I just want to say that you can't do all this work without having a bit of assistance, and there's a few people I'd like to acknowledge outside my supervisors. Kostas Politis, the president of the Greek Community of Tashkent, and the staff there, they've always been very hospitable when I've visited sort of Tashkent. Stella Lotti in Thessaloniki, who's assisted me with the transcription because literally some of that handwriting, it's impossible to decipher. Elektra Gurgutsi, Galina Galati, who's always sends me digital files when I need them. And some of the work that Helen Vitsakopoulos and Mark Corcoran has done has also been useful. I think I might bring proceedings to a close. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Nick. Let's go around now. Any questions for Nicole? The first one will make me work a little bit, right at the back. Excuse me, going right around.
Thank you, Nick. I'm curious as to who the intended audience was for those cards, and who was what was the role of the person that would be filling out, or would it be actually the combatants themselves filling it out?
It's a very good question. Number one, in the literature, I haven't been able to find out anything about this registration process, how it occurred. There's nothing mentioned in the literature. When I speak to a few combatants, they don't recall it. The only person that said something to me is the biographer of Maria Skafida, because in the 1955 one, they had to sign it at the bottom as well. What she said, they were taken to a room, and often there were others with them that could verify the data. Like she was interviewed by Vasily Barjota, for example, and then she sort of had to sign it. But with the 1955 one, I get the impression, in some cases, not all cases, they filled it out themselves, because when it says what battles took place in, there's a whole essay in some of them. I don't think someone would be writing that. And the reason, look, communist parties are known for their bureaucracy and their bureaucratic procedures. They're good at that. But the reason they would have done it is that when they arrived in Tashkent, their Greek citizenship was rescinded. They weren't given Soviet citizenship either. That took quite a few years, if not sort of decades. So legally, they're sort of in limbo. So the party was like a de facto state. So they needed this information when it came to, where do you put them in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of education and so forth. So this information was pertinent. Hope that answers your question. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
There was a hand up, I think, on this side. Any other questions? I'll come here and then go there. It's closer. Here you go.
Oh. Did any of those combatants who left, ever return to Greece?
Oh, okay. I didn't want to go into that because this is probably 10 PhDs. You can, if I look at repatriation and so forth, what you find, yes, there were people always returning to Greece, and it depended on, initially all those POWs were very easy to return. If some were very young and had no military record, they were allowed to return. You see, the first big wave of migration was in 1974 with the falling of the junta and the coming to power of Konstantinos Karamanlis, the return of democracy to Greece. That was the first big wave. There's a second wave in 1982 when Papandreou recognised the national resistance, and the last wave would have been 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So those who didn't leave by then were either sort of settled there or couldn't leave. So I'd say the majority, probably over 90%, either died there or returned, repatriated. So what you got left now, a community of 1,000, 1,500, are the children and grandchildren of the combatants. Yeah. But that in itself is a whole lecture as well. So. Yeah.
Well, congratulations, Nick. I think you did more work here than in your PhD in chemistry. That was great. With the non-Slavo-Macedonian cohort, could you break that down further into, say, what background they were like whether they were from refugee background, like Ponti or anything like that? Could you do it to that degree of refinement?
Interesting question. You've got a personal bias there, John, too. So, yeah. Okay. When you study the Greek Civil War, you hear these names: Zachariadis, Vafiadis, Ioannidis. Were the Pontians all communists or something like that? And what you also find is that the Pontians, well, the refugees in general, even in the 1940s, 1950s, they weren't really assimilated to Greek society. But mainstream society still didn't totally accept them. They were still the other. It took quite a while. In fact, this is something I mentioned on Tuesday. A Pontian once said, the only time I really felt Greek was when the Albanians arrived. So it took quite a while for them to sort of be accepted. And I try to work a way to how can I sort of get an estimate how many had like refugee background. And it's difficult because if you're Papadopoulos, you could be Pontian. So you can't just go by the name. Okay, so I looked at those that were born outside Greece, in Russia, the Soviet Union, well, that's the low-hanging fruit, okay? If you make an assumption like those that were in Macedonia, remove the Slav Macedonians, let's say 50% were of refugee background because I would think about 500,000 people were settled there. If you make some assumptions like this, I still come up with a number like 20, 22%. So in general, I don't think there were more of refugee background in the Democratic Army, but you might feel there is because those in the leadership ranks tend to have refugee surnames, and that could be misleading. But my initial estimates, I think they reflected the consensus in the Greek population. So, yeah.
It's a fabulous research, Nick. I really appreciated it. There's just a technical question. How much use have you found from LLMs in doing this research? Because it would be a great way to interrogate your data.
So
LLMs, artificial intelligence.
Look, I haven't really gone down that path at all. No, I haven't gone down that path. So yeah.
That's 3 PhDs.
The question. There's some questions there at the back.
Hey Nick, how are you?
How you doing?
You mentioned that the fighting age men and women, they went to Tashkent predominantly,
Yes, correct.
but some of the kids and the elderly went to other places.
Yeah, the general trend.
Generally.
There's exceptions, yeah.
So I get why the fighting age people went somewhere they left so they could regroup and
Yeah.
whatever, rearm, whatever they want to do. But why were the kids and the elderly leaving? What was the idea behind that?
Why? So why they were taken to Eastern Europe? Yeah. Well, with this evacuation, many people were caught up in the evacuation. Even the elderly, they could have been combatants as well. And a lot of people left because they would have been persecuted if they didn't leave. So they left for safety. And because of their status, they would have been wounded or disabled. They were taken. Look, Uzbekistan was probably the poorest out of all those countries. I mean, compared to Czechoslovakia or Poland and so forth. So they were taken to places where there were facilities to sort of care for them. So if they were elderly, wounded or disabled, and even the children, you still need facilities to sort of look after children as well. So they had a higher standard of living in those countries, and that's why they preferred, yeah. I think Theo had a question there. Or?
Well done, Nick, first of all. And I understand you're heading off to Gravana next week. May I recommend you have a nice piece of kokorechi on my behalf, εκεί στα Gravana. 1955 was probably the most tumultuous year in Tashkent. It would have affected the unity of the group. What happened after 1955? Did a significant amount of refugees or citizens of Tashkent leave Tashkent then? Because you mentioned that they left a little bit later. I would have assumed a few people would have left in 1955. And this is a difficult question, but what was the role of the Soviet Party during that conflict?
Okay. Yeah. And so,
Μιας και γίνεται λόγος για τους μαχητές του Δημοκρατικού στρατού, εγώ είμαι ένας από αυτούς.
θες να πεις κάτι, δεν δώσω το
Ήμουν
μικρόφωνο.
14 χρονών στην Ιουγκοσλαβία και επειδή ο πατέρας μου ήταν στο Δημοκρατικό στρατό, ήθελα κι εγώ να γίνω αντάρτης. Και ήμουν 14 χρονών και δεν μας πέραν. Και επειδή ήμουν και λίγο ψηλός, γράφηκα 16 και με πήραν. Πήρα μέρος και στη μάχη. Ευτυχώς που δεν σκοτώθηκα. Αλλά ένας μπροστά που τρέχαμε, ένας αγωνιστής, τρέχαμε στην επίθεση, σταμάτησε. Και το βλέπω σταματημένο. Και βλέπω την νοσοκόμα και λέω, συναγωνίστρια, ο συναγωνιστής σταμάτησε. Έρχεται η νοσοκόμα, ανοίγει το πουκάμισο και εδώ ένας κόκκινος λεκές. Και το βλέπω, πέφτει κάτω, νεκρός. Και εγώ συνεχίζω να τρέχω. Και βλέπω ένα στρατιώτη κάτω από ένα δέντρο. Με βλέπει και φοβισμένος με κοιτάει έτσι. Του λέω μη φοβάσαι. Και φεύγω.
Πού έγινε αυτό ακριβώς?
Ορίστε.
Πού έγινε αυτό που μας εξηγείτε?
Πού έγινε αυτό?
Ναι.
Αυτό έγινε πάνω από το χωριό Άνω Κλινέ στη Φλόρινα, πάνω στο βουνό. Εκεί ήταν ο στρατός. Και εγώ ήμουν στο τάγμα του Μπαρμπαλιά, έτσι το λέγανε. Μπαρμπαλιά, ήμουν στο τάγμα του και κάναμε επίθεση. Να καταλάβουμε και να τους διώξουμε. Και τελικά τους διώξαμε, αλλά ήταν πολύ σκοτωμένοι στρατιώτες. Τους κατεβάζα. Μετά οι χωριανοί μου εδώ στην Αυστραλία μου λέγαν πώς τους κατεβάζαμε τα μουλάρια, σκοτωμένους τους στρατιώτες. Ευτυχώς εμείς ήμασταν νικητές σε εκείνη τη μάχη. Στους αριθμούς εδώ που βλέπετε είμαι και εγώ ένας από αυτούς. Γιατί ήμουν και στην Τασκέντη, ήμουν και στην Πολωνία και γνωρίζω πολλούς προσωπικά, όπως τον Ζαχαριάδη. Επειδή ήμουν στη σχολή, με στείλαν στη σχολή, στη Ρουμανία και μεταξύ των άλλων είχαμε και τον Ζαχαριάδη που έρχονταν και καιρούς και μας έκανε μαθήματα. Τον Γκρόζο, Πορφυρογέννη και πολλά άλλα μέλη του πολιτικού γραφείου που είχαμε εκεί. Αυτό που θέλω να σας πω είναι ότι εδώ είδα ορισμένα ονόματα γνωστά, όπως ο Παντελής Βαϊνάς, ο στρατηγός. Ύστερα από ένα χρόνο αποστρατεύτηκα γιατί ήμουν ανήλικος. Ήμουν 15 χρονών. Και ο πατέρας μου με πήρε και επειδή δούλευε, ο πατέρας μου ήταν, το ψευδόνυμο του πατέρα μου ήταν Σπάρτακος. Σπάρτακος επειδή οι γονείς μου είναι Θρακιώτες από τη Θράκη. Ήρθαν από την Ανατολική Θράκη με την ανταλλαγή που έγινε στη Φλόρινα. Και επειδή ήταν Θρακιώτης, στην κατοχή πήρε το ψευδόνυμο Σπάρτακος. Και έτσι και έμεινε. Και προτού με στείλουν στην Αλβανία, πήγα στη διοίκηση του Βαϊνά, που είδαμε τον πατέρα του στρατηγού και έκανα ένα μήνα εκεί πέρα στην ασφάλεια του Βαϊνά και γνωρίζω και του Βαϊνά. Εδώ λόγος έγινε και το Σεβαστίκλου στην Τασκέντη. Ο Σεβαστίκλου ο ηθοποιός. Εγώ σπούδασα στο Θεατρικό Ινστιτούτο της Τασκέντες 5 χρόνια. Και το Σεβαστίκλου τον είχαμε ως καθηγητή στο μάθημα λόγος. Εμείς ως ηθοποιοί μαθαίναμε πώς να προφέρουμε ώστε κάποιοι εκεί να ακούγουν το τι λέμε. Και ο Σεβαστίκλου τον είχαμε καθηγητή και πολλούς άλλους. Στην Τασκέντη είχαμε και θεατρικό σύλλογο.
Νομίζω είναι μια πολύ ενδιαφέρον ιστορία που αξίζει να καταγραφεί κάποια στιγμή. Θα πρέπει να γραφτεί κάπου για να μάθουν περισσότερο. Σε ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ γιατί έδωσες περισσότερη αξία στην ομιλία. Ευχαριστώ. Νίκο, δεν ξέρω, προηγούμενη ερώτηση αν ήθελες να απαντήσεις.
Δεν απάντησα στον...
Θέλουμε να ξέρουμε το όνομά σας.
Theo, you're being sabotaged, sorry.
Ο κύριος που μόλις ακούσαμε είναι ο Θανάσης Παπαστεργίου. Εκτός όλων των άλλων, είπε ότι σπούδασε θέατρο και κινηματογράφο στη Σοβιετική Ένωση. Έχει υπηρετήσει και το παροικιακό θέατρο. Έχει ανεβάσει θεατρικά έργα με τη λαϊκή σκηνή, έχει ανεβάσει Αριστοφάνη στο Mark Music Ball, έχει κάνει πολλά και διάφορα. Την ιστορία του την έχουμε γράψει στον νέο κόσμο, αλλά τώρα με την ευκαιρία θα την ξαναναφέρουμε. Λοιπόν, έχει υπηρετήσει δηλαδή το παροικιακό θέατρο πιστά εδώ και δεκαετίες. Σε ευχαριστούμε, Θανάση.
Okay, I'll just get to Thea's question. The figures I've seen, after 1955, about 80% of the party members were deregistered, because most of the party members were pro-Zahariadis. That rift never healed. There were even episodes in 1961 as well. But as I said, if you're pro-Zahariadis, which the majority were at the time, you started being discriminated against, and then people looked to leave. Some were even exiled in Siberia, so you do see that that rift having an impact.
So once they were deregistered, they left Tashkent?
Well, I'm not saying that I can't tell you that because most of the information here goes up to 1955. I don't really know. There's only bits and pieces after that, so I can't really. I haven't done that analysis, although I've got lists of who departed. I still have to be able. I can't really work out if they were, pro anti-Zacharias and so forth. I don't have that level of detail, but a lot of them would have left. But those who could anyway, those who could, yeah.
We'll take.
Second part of the question: the control of the Soviet Party.
Oh, well, look, Stalin died in 1953. A de-Stalinisation process started. You had Khrushchev's secret speech in 1955. So those changes in the Soviet Party started being reflected in the leaderships of fraternal communist parties. So that development was almost inevitable. So yeah, so the Soviets would have been, they would have been conscious of this or attempts at change of leadership. So yeah, I find it hard to believe they would have been neutral. So, or they would have been supporting certain factions. Yeah.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Ήθελα να ρωτήσω τον κύριο Θανάση μία απορία που έχω, που είπε για τον μπαμπά του, για τον πατέρα του. Τον έλεγαν Σπάρτακο, μας είπε το ψευδόνυμο βέβαια στο Αντάρτικο. Ήτανε και στο Ελλάς ο μπαμπάς του. Αυτό ήθελα να ξέρω μόνο. Έτσι από απορία δική μου, να μου φύγει αυτή η απορία. Ήταν και στον Ελλάς ή μόνο στο Δημοκρατικό Στρατό?
Ναι.
Το ψευδόνυμο Σπάρτακος ήταν και στον Ελλάς.
Σίγουρα έχετε πολλά να συζητήσετε, νομίζω, μετά την ομιλία. Να πάρω ακόμη μία ερώτηση.
Σιμέλα, απλώς να συμπληρώσω κάτι. Ο κύριος δίπλα. Από ό,τι έχω δει από τις καρτέλες, τουλάχιστον όσον αφορά τους άντρες, ένα 44% ήταν πρώην Ελλασίτες. Ναι. Αυτοί που ήταν σε Τασκέντη, ναι. Όχι όλοι, αλλά ναι. Μια τελευταία ερώτηση κάποιος είχε, ναι.
You said that there's 1,500 left now in Tashkent. How do they see themselves? Do they still have strong connections to their Kukue background? How much have they assimilated, and how do they see themselves?
I think the political identity is less relevant these days. Yes, there's a certain pride that they're sort of children and grandchildren of partisans who sort of fought fascism. That's how they see their ancestors. But the emphasis at the moment is on cultural activities and also trying to learn the Greek language. The community nearly shut down a few years ago due to bad management and a few other issues. It's undergoing a renaissance at the moment. In September last year, a seconded teacher was sent there by the Greek Education Department. Also, a Greek embassy opened there as well in November. Shows the importance of Uzbekistan as a growing economy as well. So it's a diaspora community, very different to ours, which is on the ascendancy at the moment. And they're trying to engage and identify with their Greek identity as best as possible. So, yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Well, we now know a little bit more about Uzbekistan, and what I think I know now that I think Greek. I've been calling it Tashkent, but it's Tashkent, right? With the Greek pronunciation. A small gift for you.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated.
Please join me in thanking Nick for his lovely presentation. Just to close off, I do need my glasses, sorry. The next seminar will be held on the 16th of April, after Easter, with a presentation by Associate Professor Michaeli Pakogiannis, entitled «Κάνε τον πόνο σου άρπα και γέλασε και σβήσου. Η ποίηση του Κώστα Καριωτάκη, 1896-1928». It will run online. The last 2 seminars of April will be online because the Comedy Festival will be running up here in the mezzanine, and I do encourage you to have a look at the program and attend some of those events. And we're back with in-person seminars at up here in the mezzanine in May. I was going to say, please feel free to have some coffee and tea at the back, but the urn is playing up. But please do have a biscuit and some water. We look forward to your ongoing support and welcoming you to future seminars. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you. I don't know how that worked with the two.